In 1851, the Coney Hatch Lunatic Asylum opened in North London. It was designed to house 1,250 patients. At the time, the entire borough had fewer than 2,000 residents. The building wasn't an outlier. It was part of a pattern. Between 1845 and 1890, Britain constructed over 60 county asylums. Each was built to institutional scale: wide corridors, vaulted ceilings, self-contained water systems, industrial kitchens capable of feeding thousands. The architecture suggested permanence. The capacity suggested anticipation. The census data from the same period shows something else. Most of these asylums were located in counties where the recorded population of mentally ill individuals, those documented, assessed, and awaiting institutional care, numbered in the dozens. Yet the buildings could hold hundreds, sometimes over 1,000. The timing raises questions about demand forecasting in an era before modern statistics. Before we continue, a necessary note. This is a documentary examination of historical infrastructure and the timing of its construction. We are not making claims about lost civilizations, cover-ups, or hidden truths. We are observing architectural scale, census records, and construction timelines, and asking why they don't always align. The term Tartaria will be discussed later in context. What follows is an exploration of patterns, not conclusions. The official explanation is straightforward. Victorian reformers believed mental illness was underreported and that proper facilities would encourage families to seek treatment. They built for future need. They planned ahead. That explanation works, until you examine the numbers more closely. The Hanwell Asylum in Middlesex opened in 1831 with space for 300 patients. By 1850, it held over 1,000. Expansion was constant. But here's the friction. The population of Middlesex grew by roughly 40% in that period. Asylum occupancy grew by over 300%. Either mental illness was vastly more common than previously recorded, or the buildings were filling a role that hadn't been articulated in the planning documents. In the United States, the pattern repeated. The Kirkbride Plan, formalized in 1854 by psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride, became the architectural standard for American asylums. The design was grand: symmetrical wings, central administrative towers, sprawling grounds. Each facility was meant to be self-sufficient: farms, workshops, power generation, water treatment. They were built like small towns. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia was designed in 1858 to hold 250 patients. It opened in 1864. By 1880, it housed over 700. The building itself could accommodate far more. Its final capacity as built exceeded 2,400. West Virginia's total population in 1860 was just over 300,000. The question isn't whether asylums were needed. The question is why they were built at a scale that exceeded both the documented need and the rate of population growth. And why that scale was so consistent. Across England, across the eastern United States, the same architectural language appeared. The same wide halls. The same central heating systems. The same separation of wings by gender and severity. The same industrial-scale infrastructure embedded in rural or semi-rural areas. Construction timelines overlapped. Designs mirrored each other across regions that had little direct communication. The Utica State Lunatic Asylum in New York opened in 1843. It was designed for 550 patients in a city of 12,000 people. Within a decade, it was overcrowded. Not because Utica's population surged, it didn't, but because patients were arriving from across the state. That suggests a different kind of planning. The buildings weren't designed for local need. They were designed as regional infrastructure, centralized, institutional, built to absorb populations from wide geographic areas. But the census records from the 1840s and 1850s don't reflect regional demand at that scale either. In Pennsylvania, the Harrisburg State Hospital opened in 1851 with space for 250. It was expanded twice within 15 years. In Massachusetts, the Worcester State Hospital opened in 1833 and became a model for the entire country. Its capacity grew steadily, despite the fact that Massachusetts had among the most detailed public health records in the nation, and those records didn't justify the growth. If the need was documented, the scale makes sense. If the need wasn't documented, the scale suggests something else. Either a failure of record-keeping so profound it spanned decades and continents, or construction that anticipated conditions not yet reflected in the data. Some historians argue that institutionalization created its own demand, that the existence of asylums changed social behavior, making families more willing to commit relatives. That's plausible. But it doesn't explain why the buildings were so large from the beginning. It doesn't explain the uniformity. And it doesn't explain why so many opened within the same narrow window of time, in regions with vastly different population densities, economic conditions, and governance structures. By 1890, England alone had over 100,000 people living in asylums. That's roughly 1 in every 290 people. In some counties, the ratio was even higher. The infrastructure to house them had been under construction for 50 years. The architecture was already there. The systems were already in place. The capacity had been waiting. Whether that reflects extraordinary foresight, institutional coordination across borders, or something else, that's where the tension begins. The pattern wasn't limited to asylums. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened across New York State. It was 363 miles long, required 83 locks, and cost over $7 million, roughly $200 million in today's currency. The project took 8 years to complete. New York's population in 1825 was approximately 1.6 million. The canal was built to handle commercial traffic that wouldn't reach capacity for another 30 years. The infrastructure preceded the demand. The same timing appears in Britain. Between 1830 and 1850, railway construction exploded. Over 6,000 miles of track were laid in 2 decades. Stations were built in towns that barely justified them. The Great Western Railway's Paddington Station opened in 1854 with capacity for traffic volumes London wouldn't see until the 1880s. The architecture was grand. The engineering was precise. The scale was disproportionate. And the administrative systems that governed these projects, land surveys, engineering standards, labor contracts, financing structures, appeared nearly simultaneously across England and the United States. There was no internet. No international regulatory body. Yet the blueprints looked the same. Asylum construction followed the same rhythm. Between 1845 and 1860, the County Asylums Act in England mandated that every county build a facility. The law didn't specify size. It didn't dictate architectural style. Yet the buildings that emerged were almost interchangeable. Long rectangular wings. Central administrative blocks. Separate chapels. Airing courts enclosed by high walls. Kitchens designed to serve hundreds. Laundries with industrial equipment. Water towers. Gas lighting. Central heating systems that required dedicated boiler rooms and miles of pipe. This wasn't vernacular architecture. This was institutional standardization. In America, the Kirkbride asylums followed the same template. The plans were published, yes, but they were adopted with remarkable consistency, even in states with different climates, labor markets, and construction resources. The Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, the Friends Asylum in Pennsylvania, the Brattleboro Retreat in Vermont, they all shared the same DNA. And they were all built before the populations they served had been fully documented. Consider the infrastructure embedded in these buildings. The Coney Hatch Asylum had its own gas works, farm, cemetery, and fire brigade. It wasn't a hospital. It was a self-contained settlement. The same was true in the United States. The Hudson River State Hospital in New York included 1,000 acres of farmland, orchards, a dairy, a bakery, and a fully equipped workshop complex. Patients worked the land, maintained the grounds, and produced goods for internal use. These were designed as closed systems, independent of the towns around them. That raises a question about planning assumptions. If these facilities were meant to integrate patients back into society, why were they built to function in isolation? If they were temporary solutions to a medical crisis, why were they constructed with such permanence? The stone was cut to last centuries. The foundations were over-engineered. The drainage systems were designed for populations far larger than initial patient counts. It's as if the architects knew something the records didn't reflect. In Pennsylvania, the Danville State Hospital opened in 1872 with space for 500 patients. The building's infrastructure, plumbing, heating, kitchen capacity, could support 3 times that number. By 1890, it held over 1,600. The expansion wasn't reactive. The capacity was already there. This pattern of over-preparation extended beyond asylums. Prisons, workhouses, poorhouses, and orphanages all followed similar trajectories. Britain's workhouse system, formalized under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, resulted in the construction of over 600 facilities within 2 decades. Each was built to hold far more people than local poverty rates suggested. The Kensington and Chelsea Workhouse opened in 1849 with space for 700 residents. The surrounding area had a population of roughly 20,000. That's a ratio of 1 institutional bed for every 28 people. For context, modern homeless shelter capacity in major cities rarely exceeds 1 bed per 200 residents. Either Victorian Britain anticipated a social collapse, or the buildings were serving a function that wasn't fully captured in public health records. The same logic applied to orphanages. The Foundling Hospital in London, established in 1739, expanded dramatically in the 19th century. By 1850, it was processing over 1,000 children annually. Similar institutions appeared across the United States, often in small towns, often with capacity that seemed excessive for local populations. The infrastructure was synchronized. The timelines overlapped. The architectural language was shared. And the administrative frameworks that made these projects possible, county governance, centralized funding, standardized building codes, emerged almost simultaneously in England and the United States during the same narrow period. That's not unusual in itself. Nations learned from each other. Best practices spread. But the speed was remarkable, and the scale was consistent. By 1870, institutional architecture had become a dominant feature of the landscape. Every county in England had at least 1 asylum. Most had multiple facilities, workhouses, prisons, infirmaries. The United States mirrored the pattern. State hospitals appeared in nearly every region, often in locations far from urban centers. The buildings were designed to absorb populations. The systems were designed to manage them. The infrastructure was designed to sustain them indefinitely. Whether this reflects inheritance of earlier systems, convergent thinking among reformers, or coordination we no longer see evidence of, that's where the term Tartaria enters the conversation. Not as an answer, as a lens. The word Tartaria appears on maps from the 16th through 19th centuries. It wasn't a country. It was a catch-all geographic label applied to vast regions of Central Asia and Siberia that European cartographers knew little about. The term came from Tatar, referring to Turkic and Mongol peoples. Over time, Tartaria became shorthand for unmapped territory, a placeholder for regions beyond direct European contact. By the late 1800s, the label had faded. Modern borders replaced it. Nation-states were formalized. The word disappeared from official use. In recent years, Tartaria has been reinterpreted, not as a geographic label, but as a framework for examining architectural and infrastructural patterns that feel misaligned with accepted timelines. The term has become a lens, a way of asking why so much institutional infrastructure appeared so suddenly at such scale in the mid-19th century. It's not a claim. It's a question. 3 interpretations have emerged. The first is mainstream historical consensus. Rapid industrialization, social reform movements, and centralized governance created both the need and the means for large-scale institutional construction. Asylums, prisons, and workhouses were responses to urbanization, poverty, and emerging medical knowledge. The buildings were large because reformers overestimated future need, or underestimated how quickly those facilities would fill. This interpretation is well documented. It aligns with archival records. It explains most of what we see, but it struggles with the timing. And it struggles with the uniformity. The second interpretation suggests inheritance, that the institutional systems of the 19th century were built on top of earlier frameworks we no longer fully see. that the asylums, workhouses, and prisons were not inventions but renovations, that the infrastructure already existed in some form, and Victorian reformers repurposed it. This would explain the scale. It would explain the speed. It would explain why the architecture feels older than its official construction dates. It would also require evidence of large-scale institutional infrastructure before 1800, evidence that isn't widely present in the historical record. The third interpretation is more abstract. It suggests that the label Tartaria is useful not because it names a lost civilization, but because it names a gap, a period where infrastructure, governance, and administrative systems underwent a transformation so rapid and so synchronized that the official explanations feel incomplete. This view doesn't claim anything was hidden. It claims something was compressed. That between 1800 and 1870, institutions, railways, canals, asylums, prisons, public records, and standardized architecture all emerged in a narrow window, and that the explanations for why this happened simultaneously across continents are less coordinated than the results. None of these interpretations are definitive. Each has limitations. What remains is the evidence itself. The buildings, the capacity, the timing, the architectural consistency, the administrative synchronization, the census gaps, the over-engineering, the fact that so many of these structures were designed to absorb populations that didn't yet exist in the numbers the infrastructure implied. And then there's 1816, the year without a summer. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia sent ash into the atmosphere, disrupting weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed. Temperatures dropped. Famine spread across Europe and North America. In the years that followed, institutional construction accelerated. Poorhouses, workhouses, asylums, orphanages. The timing isn't proof of causation, but it is a hinge point, a moment where social systems came under pressure, and the response was infrastructure at unprecedented scale. Whether that infrastructure was new, or whether it represented the formalization of systems that had existed informally, that's an open question. When people use the term Tartaria today, they're often not arguing for a specific historical claim. They're pointing at a feeling, a sense that the infrastructure of the 19th century carries a weight that the official timelines don't fully account for. The buildings feel too grand. The systems feel too complete. The coordination feels too precise. And the populations those systems were designed to manage weren't yet documented at the scale the infrastructure implied. That dissonance is what drives the question. Not, was there a lost civilization? But, why does the infrastructure of the 19th century feel like it was built for a world that already existed, rather than one that was emerging? The asylums were built for populations that didn't exist yet. The canals were dug for commerce that hadn't arrived. The railways connected towns that barely justified stations. The administrative systems appeared before the populations they governed had been fully counted. Either this reflects extraordinary foresight, planning on a scale and with a coordination that seems almost impossible without modern communication, or it reflects something else. Something we see in the architecture but struggle to find in the documents. The term Tartaria has become a metaphor for that gap. Not a place, not a claim, but a placeholder for the questions that remain when you stand in front of a Victorian asylum and realize it was designed to hold 1,000 people in a county of 10,000, and that it was one of dozens built in the same decade, using the same plans across an ocean. The evidence invites examination. The patterns invite questions. The scale invites discomfort. And the official explanations, while coherent, don't always feel sufficient when you're standing in the corridors. History is not a single story. It's an accumulation of records, buildings, systems, and silences. Sometimes the buildings say one thing, the records say another, and the gap between them becomes the subject of inquiry. That's what this is. Not revelation, not accusation. Just the observation that when you build infrastructure for populations that don't exist yet, and you do it across continents in the same narrow window, using the same architectural language with the same administrative systems, you create a question that outlasts the buildings themselves. The asylums are still there. Many have been repurposed. Some still stand empty. Their capacity remains. Their architecture endures. And the question they pose, about timing, about scale, about the systems that built them and the populations they anticipated, remains unanswered. Not because the answer is hidden, but because the question was never fully asked.